Good evening and welcome.
Well, thank you very much. It is very much an honor and a pleasure to be here, and I would be remiss if I didn't start by thanking you, President Arnold, and the members of your board for the leadership that you provide to our statewide association. As many people may know, Wichita has an automatic seat on our board of directors and our legislative committee and other committees. Looking around, most of the board has already served in those, at least the ones that I've been involved with, and you will get your chance if you haven't had a chance to do that. It is also great for me. My primary work with KASB is to represent the districts of the state in the legislative process, the political process, but to be able to step away from that, come out and see the work that school boards do and have a chance just a little bit to observe the students and teachers and the people that are a part of public education. And finally, to thank your representative, Topeka Diane Jerstead, for being my chauffeur down here tonight and getting me back to work on testimony for tomorrow. So I will try to move through this. I believe you saw this presented earlier. I'm going to give you kind of a high-level summary, and it is not all good news. There's some good news and some not so good news that I think we want to talk about. The first thing I would just draw your attention to is a slide where we've taken some numbers directly from the governor's budget to try to answer the question there's always a lot of concern about, and that is, you know, what's really happening to school spending in Kansas, to our support for education. This information from the governor's budget shows how since 2012, total funding provided by the state for education has in fact increased every year. You can see the dollar amounts. It is expected to do so not only in the current year, 2016, but next year. And you can see the percent increases on the bottom. And so in fact, the idea that total funding from the state for education has been increasing is absolutely true. We, on the next slide, want to break that down a little, though, by showing why the concerns that you often hear from yourselves and other districts around the state suggest that there is more to that story. On this chart, the red lines show where we have taken out of the total of state aid those parts of the budget that do not go to districts for operating expenses. I hasten to say that doesn't mean that these are unimportant expenditures. They're very important. They're the aid we provide for our retirement system, for CAPERS. There's the dollars that go to support equalization for capital outlay and bond and interest. And finally, we recognize what happened several years ago when the legislature responded to a court order to fully fund local option budget equalization, and in many cases, including yours, because your total LOB is capped, the result was property tax reduction in many districts. That's a good thing for the taxpayer, but it's no more dollars for the district to spend. So line 8 of this chart shows you that when you take those dollars out, the increases have actually been then much smaller. You can compare the percentage increases in line 9 to the increases in line 3 and see the part of state aid that is available for operations has actually been growing at a slower rate. And then finally on this chart, we kind of bring it all together by showing the changes in enrollment in our districts and give you a per pupil amount. Again, these are the dollars provided by the state, not local dollars, not federal dollars, major categories of state aid. This, in effect, is what comes to you on average per pupil. Line 12 shows you the percentage increase, and then line 13 is the rate of inflation. And so what this shows is that, again, since 2012, every year except one, the per pupil increase has been less than the rate of inflation. So what that means is the implication that state funding is going up is true, but compared to inflation, we've been falling behind. And I think where sometimes legislators and school leaders have a disagreement, to the legislature it's often seen it's a cut if you have less money than the previous year. From the school perspective, if our costs are rising faster than our revenue, to cover the things we can't control, we have to make cuts elsewhere in our budget to deal with that. And so kind of the two groups sort of look at cuts in a different way. They're both telling the truth, but I think this illustrates why even though dollars are rising, it's still a struggle at the local level to make ends meet. Now, in this chart, we've just given you a little longer comparison between fiscal year 2009. We picked that year because, frankly, that was the high water mark of funding, really, before the cuts after the Great Recession. And you can see that over that period, the very top line shows that total funding for schools has gone up almost 9%, $300 million. But if you drop out the changes in those parts of the budget that doesn't reach schools, you go down to line 8, you can see that, again, that regular operating money has only gone up $63 million, or less than 2%. If you look at it on a per pupil basis since 2009, we're actually $46 lower than we were at that point, and inflation has gone up almost 15%. So again, this is to give you some context. Another way to look at this chart just shows you the year-to-year change. It's confusing because what you see in 2010 shows some very drastic cuts the legislature had to make, but part of that was done by shifting some of the spending into 2011, and that shows an unusual jump in the brown bar, and then you can see that fell again in 2012. So those years are a little distorted, but again, we hope it just makes the point that the state operating aid per pupil has generally been running a little bit behind the rate of inflation most years. Didn't happen last year only, well, I shouldn't say only, maybe the good news was because we had historically low inflation. A couple of other things I think it's important to understand about our school funding in light of our state economy. What this chart does is show you the average yearly change in Kansas personal income. Well, the first thing it shows you is the total change in Kansas personal income, which is just an economic statistic that means the total income of all people in the state. And we've gone back over several historical periods all the way back to 1975, and then we show you the average yearly change and then the average yearly change after inflation. So, for example, from 1975 to 1982, the average change every year was almost 11%, an increase in income. But remember, if you will, inflation was also very high, so the actual real change in personal income in the state was about 2%. So you can look at that over those different periods of time. The concerning thing is if you come down to 2008 to 2017, which means basically what has happened in Kansas since the Great Recession, you can see that the average change in income for the people of our state, and again I want to stress, not the state of Kansas government, but the people of Kansas, has only been about 1.2% a year. That's the lowest average change of any period of time we've looked at. If you compare us a little broadly to the rest of the country, what this shows are those same years. It shows you personal income growth from the previous page. Then it shows you per capita income growth. That's income growth divided by the population. As you can see, this last period of time, 2008 to 2017, for, if you think of it, the average Kansan, income has gone up less than 0.2% after inflation. This has been less than the national average. So we are in a different economy. The growth of our state economy and national economy is historically much lower. So we have to understand that our patrons, your patrons, the taxpayers, are in a different environment that they've been in. Some periods of time, Kansas has grown faster than the rest of the country. The years in red are when we've been below the rest of the country. And the last thing I want to touch on here is to compare Kansas personal income, again, this is an average change after inflation, with school district expenditures, total, and then school operating budgets. Now, you'll note that most years, total district expenditures were higher than or about equal to the change in personal income. That basically meant that our funding of schools increased as about the same rate as our overall economy. If you look at the most recent years, 2008 to 2017, while personal income has grown about 1.2% a year, total school funding has only increased about 0.2%. and school operating budgets, which kind of go back to what I was explaining before, have actually had negative growth after inflation over this period of time. Just remember, the difference between the two, total expenditures, is everything all districts spend from all sources on all purposes. Your operating budgets for this definition are just the general fund, LOB, special ed, basically what you use for education. So it excludes bond payments, capital outlay, capers. Those are included in total expenditures. They're not included in operating expenditures. So this, we hope, gives you kind of a snapshot of both what's happened to school funding recently and then some historical context. I want to turn to just briefly touch a little bit broader and look at how Kansas compares to other states. We've looked at this in a couple of ways, and the first thing we thought was important to do is compare ourselves to other states in terms of how well we do educating students. How well do we do preparing students to be successful? We've come up with the term we call aspiration states to look at those states that do better than Kansas on 14 measures of achievement. We have 6 measures called student attainment, which are basically graduation rates. And then we have 8 measures of student achievement, which would be national reading and math scores, ACT and SAT, basically looking at student performance before they graduate. And our definition of outperform are states that rank higher than Kansas if you average performance, or are higher than Kansas on 8 out of those 14 measures. So the question is, how many states do better than Kansas on a majority of these 14 measures? This gives you a little more detail on what those are. But here's the map. There are only 7 states in the country that do better than Kansas on a majority of those 14 measures: New Hampshire, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Vermont, Indiana, Iowa, and Nebraska. Every other state might do better than Kansas on some measures, but only these states do better than Kansas on a majority of these measures. And all of these states provide more funding in total dollars for their students than Kansas, both in terms of actual dollars and if you adjust for regional cost differences. You can see Kansas is below all these other states. So every state that does better than Kansas on a majority of these measures provides at least some degree more funding than Kansas does. This chart just kind of shows you, I only threw it in if you're really interested in data, it plots the percent of childhood poverty with per capita income and shows you, not surprisingly, that the higher average income is, the less poverty you have. But then it also shows you the cluster of those aspirational states. They are states which have relatively low poverty, relatively high income, and that's no surprise because they're well-educated states. And nothing makes a better impact on raising your income and lowering poverty than having high education, high-skill workforce. We have also looked at states that are most like Kansas on several measures. I'm just going to basically tell you, for purposes of thinking through this, who are the states that are most like Kansas in terms of the students they serve, their adult population, and their population distribution, which basically, are you rural or urban like Kansas, and then overall. 23 states are peers to Kansas in one or more of these 4 categories. Once again, if you just look at the average of these groups, our average total revenue per pupil is lower than the average of all of these groups. So we spend less than the states that are most like us on average. Just kind of summarizing, Kansas has higher overall achievement than all but 7 states. All higher achieving states spend more per pupil. We have higher achievement than the average of states most like Kansas. We spend less than the average of states most like Kansas. And every peer state that ranks higher than Kansas in achievement spends more per pupil, which again, if you do better than Kansas, you're one of our aspiration states. Last thing I want to show you, and then if you have questions or the time, I'll be happy to respond, is to look at our funding and organizational patterns compared to these other states. And here's a couple of things that come to mind. First of all, Kansas relies more on state aid and less on federal aid than comparison states. This chart doesn't show you the total dollars, it shows you the percentage. And so Kansas ranks pretty high nationally in how much of our money comes from the state as opposed to local sources like property taxes, and we rank very low in the percent of our money that comes from federal aid compared to other states. And again, this is not looking at the national average, it's looking at either the states that do better or the states that are most like us. This chart does show you the total dollars spent. As you can see, the average of our aspiration peers is about $15,000, and this was in 2013 compared to Kansas, which spent about $11,500. The blue portion of this is current spending, similar but not identical to the current operating expense. This is to give comparable definitions across all states. As you can see, perhaps we are a little bit lower we're lower in total spending. We're a little higher than most states in terms of what we spend on capital outlay and debt payment. Now, this has been a point of controversy. There are legislators and others who are concerned that Kansas is spending too much on buildings. Well, it's hard to decide whether we're spending too much, too little, or not enough. We are spending a little bit more. But the important thing to remember is that under our Kansas school finance system, the current spending, the blue bar, is basically limited by the state. That's your general fund, which the state has set, or your LOB, which the state has capped. Bonds, debts, capital outlay are really the part of the budget that's controlled by local voters in Kansas. So the place we're a little high is actually the area where Kansas voters have a choice. This again shows we are high compared to our peer groups in terms of debt and cash on hand. So there's a distinction. This table is a little hard to read, but it breaks down the operating budget by broad categories. The bottom blue portion is what is spent on instruction. The other categories are things like pupil support, which are things like counselors and nurses. Instructional support is what you spend on libraries, media centers, general administration, school administration. Operations and maintenance, the kind of orange band is what you spend on utilities and upkeep, custodial support, pupil transportation, and other support. And as you can see, what this shows is Kansas is below all other states in terms of total dollars. However, the percent that our districts allocate to instruction is actually higher than our aspiration states and peers. This chart shows you capital where we spend on construction and debt payments. As we've said, we're higher here than our peers. Interestingly, we are the highest in the country in spending on instructional equipment. In other words, equipment specifically used in instruction, computers, iPads, those sorts of things, we're the highest in the country, perhaps because that's an area where districts have been able to access more dollars through capital outlay, bonds, and such things, and invest in this area. Finally, let's look a little bit at district organization, and again, I think this will be surprising to some. Kansas ranks very low compared to other states in district and school size. So, for example, if you look at the blue bar, that essentially shows you the average number of pupils per district in the state. The red bar shows you the average number of schools. So we have smaller districts than our peers, but interestingly enough, the states that do best, the aspiration states, also tend to have smaller districts. So one of the suggestions the legislature is dealing with, do we need more consolidation? Would we be more efficient if we had larger districts? This suggests that's not necessarily the case. Now, I'm always quick to point out here in the largest district in the state, this is not saying that larger districts do better. It's just saying among the organization of states, having lots of large districts or larger districts does not appear to equate to better performance. Likewise, Kansas has a lower pupil-teacher ratio, a lower class size than any of our peers or even the aspiration states, and we have fewer students per total staff, if you want to think of it that way, than any group except the aspiration states. So what this tells us is Kansas invests in people. We have more teachers, we have more total staff, and the numbers, if you look at the aspiration states, and again, the fact that Kansas does better than all of our peers, perhaps suggests that that's a good investment. Having more people is what seems to be associated with higher performance. Finally, Kansas is about average in students per support staff and per administrator. But again, if you look at aspiration states, the interesting way to look at this is the best achieving states in the country have low ratios, which basically means you have more support staff and, in fact, more administrators than average. Now, how can that be? That sounds inefficient. Well, I think what this suggests is that if you have more people doing a good job, you have a better chance of producing good results. At least that's what these numbers tend to suggest. So my conclusion, to try to tie this all together, both the Kansas economy and K-12 funding has been growing much slower since 2008 than in past periods. Despite that, Kansas outperforms most states in student success, and we outperform most states that are most like Kansas. The states that rank higher than Kansas in achievement spend more per pupil, and it's worth noting that there are a lot of states that spend more than Kansas that have less positive results. We rely more on state aid and less on federal aid than most of our peer states. We have a slightly higher share of total funding that goes to capital costs, but a higher share of operating budgets that goes to instruction. And Kansas and most of the most successful states tend to have smaller classes, smaller schools, smaller districts, and more adults per pupil. And I would be happy, if there is time and you're willing, to entertain any questions.
Well, first of all, thank you for a wonderful presentation, because as school board members, oftentimes we have to explain what's going on, and to explain this, we need to understand it ourselves. What I'd like to ask you is from a legislative perspective, and if they see the data that we are performing well with less money being spent, how do you actually tie all of this in so that not only do our legislators understand that we really are seeing an inadequate in terms of operating, we're seeing inadequate funding. How do we tie that in so that it does make sense, or is that something you're able to answer?
Well, if I really had a good answer, I would be in Topeka doing that tonight instead of coming and talk to you to try to get those answers. You know, I'm going to say that some of this information is frankly fairly new. I mean, really, one of the things that happened with the block grant bill and all of that, knowing we'd be looking at a new finance formula, our staff, our research department, really tried to kind of start anew and kind of question everything and really go back to see what the research said. So in many ways, we're just beginning to share this. So that's one point I would say. Second thing is, you know, I'm not going to tell you that someone else couldn't come in with a different set of information and facts and tell you some different things, because some of it becomes a question of what do you choose to look at when you measure performance. Let me give you an example. Kansas, although we historically have done fairly well on things like the National Assessment of Education Progress, we don't do as well there, and we've been slipping a little bit in recent years compared to things like graduation rates or ACT scores. So to some extent, you have to decide what information you're going to share. We are trying to share very broadly, but not everyone does that. So you have to decide what's the credibility, what data do you want to look at? That would be part of it. And then I think the second thing is, I think for many legislators, many members of the public, there's just some assumptions that just seem to make common sense. Well, boy, we've got a lot of districts in Kansas. That just can't be very efficient. Well, from an argument that just starts with the idea that lots of small organizational units can't be efficient, that's self-evident. What we're trying to do is say, well, let's look at really what the results are and then kind of challenge that assumption and maybe, again, have some thoughts about why that might or might not be the case. I guess my best answer is to say, you know, we're trying to introduce some new data, some new information into the debate, and a lot of that is, frankly, opportunities like this to share this with you so you can look at the same kind of things at your local district level and then make those points.
Joy?
Hi, Mark. First of all, I want to thank you for your report tonight and for the research that KASB has been doing. This is a very balanced report, and I think it speaks to people on both sides of the aisle, and it speaks to our community. I get a lot of questions from parents saying, where can I go to get good data that I can trust? And sometimes it's hard to tell them where to go. And so I think this, for me, this will be something I will be sharing with parents in my district. So thank you for that. I want to ask you just a couple quick questions for clarity. On one of your slides, I think it's slide 9, you talked about the Kansas economy and school funding average annual change less than inflation. That was it right there.
This one? Mm-hmm.
The next one here.
This one or back?
This one right here. I wanted to just ask you a question about this because I know federal funds aren't included in these numbers around budgets. But as you probably recall, a couple of Supreme Court hearings ago, the state argued that they took into account that federal funds had increased between 2008 and 2013 at that time, or 10 or whatever it was, and that therefore the state aid not going up as much sort of balanced out. Do you have an idea? Do you have a sense of if that's why this number is low here, if we counted federal funds in, or is that number not general fund like? It's tied to specific things. Could you talk about that a little bit?
The total district expenditure column does include federal funds.
Okay.
That would be all numbers. And as you can see, the school district operating budget does not. And the fact that the operating budgets are much lower would, if I remember my math, indicate that the other portion was going up faster. I should, and I'll tell you, one of the things that's very hard to explain and keep track of and not have people sometimes question your numbers is there are so many different potential definitions, and frankly, I think they are correct. It's how you choose to use them. So when we say school district operating budgets, I want to make clear we can go back to 1975 with that number. I don't have those numbers back to 1975. But frankly, if you were talking about operating budgets from just an accounting viewpoint, federal dollars could legitimately be included because things that would fund your title programs, those are operating budgets as well. So this doesn't include federal, mostly because we just don't have that level of detail going back that far. Now, the other point I'd just make is it's also important to remember that even within federal funding, I always draw the distinction between what part of federal dollar is, again, kind of going to education and what part is food service.
Right.
We've had a bigger increase in food service, which is federal funding, and it, again, plays an important role. But the fact that you may have more kids eligible for free lunch and food costs are going up, that slice of your budget doesn't give you any more dollars to hire teachers or provide salaries or adopt new programs. And to me, the hard thing is to try to objectively tell the whole story so people don't think you're hiding something, but also be able to be discreet enough to explain why those different programs and different sources have a different meaning when they change.
Right. Okay. Thank you for explaining that, because that's exactly what I was hoping you would say to help clarify that. A few slides later, you talked about Kansas has lower total spending but higher percentage on capital debt, and you said something along the lines of local voters have a choice. They choose to do the capital outlay projects. And I want to clarify that because I don't think you meant it this way, but the way I heard that was that when they have a choice, they go for education as if there was no choice in who they elect for state. And so what's really clear is when they have a local choice, they choose for capital outlay, and then sometimes voters might be schizophrenic on who they vote for in the state, not realizing that those are education dollars too. So just to clarify that. And then the last question I just had for you around that slide and the slide about instructional equipment is, do we have a sense on the aspiration states on whether their buildings are newer or older than ours, or if perhaps things like state testing, all of our state testing in the state of Kansas is done on computers, and there are still states, I believe, that still use paper and pencil for their, so we would need to make those investments as an education community so our students could go through testing and be more efficient. Do we have any idea in these comparisons what that might look like?
I hate to give you the short answer of no, we don't.
That's okay.
The one thing I can tell you is pretty much all of this information comes from federal reports that states make to the Census Bureau or the federal government. So we hope these numbers are consistent, and I think they're reasonably consistent, but I'm not going to tell you that every state may look at it exactly the same way. What we do know is that of our aspiration states, they tend to be more northeastern states or midwestern states, which may not be growing as rapidly as, say, the west or the south. On the other hand, Kansas is not growing particularly rapidly either. So that there is a real dichotomy there, and to me, that's just one of the things we need to acknowledge, that it's there. Whatever it means, it doesn't mean necessarily good or bad, but it's a fact we have to recognize. And some of this very much surprised me, but we thought we need to see what the data is and then share it, whatever we find.
Sure. Well, really appreciate you being here tonight, all the way down from Topeka, and I really appreciate your years of service in the state of Kansas to forward students' education. A lot of people in the world may not know who Mark Tallman is, but in the education circles, you're very highly respected. I know among many of our legislators you are as well. So thank you for all your service to our state.
Well, that makes the drive down worth it. I appreciate that.
John?
Mr. Tallman, just a quick question. On the slide that says Kansas relies more on state aid, less on federal aid than comparison states, just a question. I know it would be difficult to parcel this out, because I have heard the comment that when you look as a percentage, Kansas is spending more of their state budget on education than others. However, I also know that the way in which that's calculated would be difficult. And not that Texas is an aspiration state, but for example, in Texas, the local school district collects the property taxes. Therefore, it's considered local funds. And only then a small portion flows to the state that is then dispersed out. Kansas, on the other hand, our local taxes now are collected at the state level and counted as state aid. So it would be, depending on how that works in each given state, could skew one way or the other. Would that be fair to say?
It certainly could. Now, this again is 2013 data, so this would be from even before that change was made. My guess would be that when we get 2015 and beyond data, it might show that red bar even higher. It is important to recognize that Kansas sort of made a deliberate choice 20-some years ago when we went to the finance formula that we had used, raised state taxes, drove down property taxes. The policy choice we kind of have now as a state is if the state, if the governor and a majority of legislators continue to believe that we need to reduce and ultimately eliminate the income tax, which has traditionally been about half of our state revenue, I don't think there's any question it will be harder to sustain that level of state commitment. Then the choice becomes, do you go ahead and turn more to local choices, or do you do without it? And that, I think, is the point that this would kind of make. One could look at this and say, well, we've got some states that apparently do okay with their kids, do better than we do, that relies more locally. It can be done, but those may be states that are very different in how their wealth is distributed. It may have different issues of equalization and all
The
of those
equity
things.
component then
Exactly.
becomes a
That,
key
I
issue.
think, to me, that's the great challenge we face. On one hand, I think voters tend to be more willing to raise local taxes when they see they keep it, they see where it goes, which could argue we might be better off with more local choices. On the other hand, it becomes much more difficult to keep that equalized if you don't have a state aid component. And that, I think, is one of the biggest balancing acts our legislature in a new formula is going to have to confront.
Thank you.
Cheryl?
Yeah, I'd like to go back to your first slide that you showed where you're talking about the governor's budget up and down. Yeah, it's right after that. There you go. And as I have visited with legislators, I hear them say, you know, we keep giving you more money every year. And this is the chart that they're addressing. The charts that are on the next three charts that kind of pull out the other pieces out of it, how much information at the state legislative level are they getting showing this?
Well, all of this information is really in the governor's budget. I think we added the line with the CPI, and we've done some things like that. But I'm not sure that many legislators think about it in that way. In other words, what we've done here is we start with the total categories. If you look at the governor's budget, that's the bottom line. They kind of add up everything and say, here it is. What we've tried to do is say, okay, well, let's start with that total, but then let's look at these different components to come to the conclusion of what it means at the district level. I do believe, though, that we do have a terrible communication problem, and both sides make it worse. Because from a legislative viewpoint, well, look how much we're giving you, you just don't appreciate it, and without perhaps them having a deeper understanding of where the dollars go and what they can be used for. And I think from the school advocacy viewpoint, we're so busy always talking about how much we've been cut that they feel that demonstrably that isn't true.
Right.
And so the challenge is getting both sides, I think, to come a little bit to the middle and see and recognize that, well, both sides have a point. We have to acknowledge that to the legislatures, those red lines that they're spending it, and the taxpayers are paying it. And we're advocates for everything on that line. So we can't say that doesn't count, but I think we have to understand that once you've done that important work, what's left that we then have to work with, the decisions you have to make and struggle with, why you're struggling with that. So somehow we have to bring people together around that conversation.
And I think that's exactly where we are, is trying to figure out how do we change the conversation to be able to have them hear us, and consequently vice versa, that we listen to them. Because when I look at that first slide, basically when they moved capers into our budgets as part of our operating budgets as opposed to pulling it out, because obviously we're not arguing that we have capers and that we've always had capers, but it hasn't always been considered part of what we do for students, because it's not for students.
Right.
It's for our retired employees. But that jumps the percentages up significantly. And as those are pulled out on the other slides, and then we begin to adjust for, in that third slide where we're looking at the costs, the change per year and the inflation rate, that's where we're sitting right now, trying to figure, our health care is going up, our electricity's going up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to the tune of millions of dollars, and we're getting no more money. Right. So that percentage is what we're trying to deal with as we begin to look at cutting millions of dollars out of our budget.
And here, too, I think if you really want to phrase it correctly, it's not that you're getting no more money, it's that next year you're expected to get 0.55% of an increase when the inflation rate alone is expected to be
at
four times that, three or four times that.
2.10.
Exactly. But that's the semantics. We slip into we're not getting any more money because in terms of what you can do with it, it doesn't feel like more money, but to the legislature, well, look, right here, we're putting $38 million more in just in this, even after you take out capers and everything else. The block grant's going to go up to, so 38 million sounds like a lot of money. But in the scheme of the block grants, when it's 0.5%, it's not very much money. But once again, so from their viewpoint, but you're not being cut, you're getting more money. From our viewpoint, we have to help them understand, at least I think that's our challenge, but let's understand that that just doesn't go far enough to cover our operations of what you're expecting us to do and what our voters are expecting us to do.
Our normal operating expenses.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think a final thing, I know you need to move me along, but the other thing that I believe is kind of significant, it is often suggested that, well, school funding historically has gone up more than the rate of inflation, so you shouldn't complain is kind of the implication. But I think what these show us is that the economy tends to grow more than inflation. I mean, that's really what productivity is. People want to get ahead of inflation. And so part of our argument is to say just getting enough for inflation isn't enough if we're going to pay competitive salaries to other wages that are rising faster, or if we have more kids, or if you want us to do more things. So there, too, we have to have that explanation. What does funding beyond inflation, what does it get us? What does it buy? And at least part of the thing we've tried to say, that at least in Kansas, what it's bought is well above average achievement for essentially below average expenditures per pupil.
Which we certainly don't want that to change.
No. However, I just never being unwilling to have the last word. I would just note I do think it is critically important. What worries me on this is just to understand. We have to understand the environment that we're in. We have to understand what Kansans are also feeling. And I guess what it comes back to, while you're struggling to make these decisions, understand that kind of represent what your average constituent, they're also struggling with these. And we have to, I think, be aware of and understand that and make sure people do understand the stewardship that you're trying to do and provide with that.
Mike?
Good evening.
Conversations have been back and forth about operating and non-operating costs. And every time I hear somebody else talk, they speak of different operating costs versus different non-operating costs. Is there a standard that we can get to that says this cost is, or is there anybody that agrees what an operating cost is and what a non-operating cost is? And I believe that also is another way of saying what goes to the classroom and what does not go to the classroom.
Well, let's start by saying that I am not an accountant. There are, I think, some accountant understandings of some of these terms. There is a Kansas School District Accounting Handbook that has some of these definitions in them. And as I said, I'm not strictly following them here, because strictly speaking, you could say that an operating budget, I'm assuming people would indicate, is what you spend in sort of annual expenses that would not be debt or equipment or building costs, capital costs. Yet when I use the term operating, I'm really more trying to isolate it to things like your general fund budget, your LOB, because that's really where education takes place. So, even there, I admit I'm being confusing. Then when you look at instruction, and here's where I think we have the real challenge, and that is instruction is sort of held up as the main thing districts ought to do. The instruction is just a category of expenditures that has to do with direct interaction between teachers and students. That's all it is. Not good, not bad. It's just a description. And instruction is part of your operating budget. But transportation is part of your operating budget, and food service is part of your operating budget, and student support functions are part of your operating budget as well. So the way I'd answer that, I went back to saying, if you look at other states, most states spend about 60% of their operating budget on instruction. Kansas is above average on that, But most states, if you look at all expenditures, which would be capital costs, then it probably comes down to about maybe 50%, and Kansas is also around 50%, maybe a little bit lower in that area. So even there, when we talk about the dollars to the classroom, we sometimes hear the 65%. When some people talk about, they're talking about 65% of operating, or the other sometimes term used is current operating expenses. Other times people talk about instruction as percent of your total budget. Those are two very different numbers. One's about 62%, one is about 50%.
Mark, thank you very much.
Lynn?
Mark, I appreciate your comments and your thoughts here, and I guess I understand the concern that we've got a communication problem. But at the same point, I guess I take it kind of personal when I get accused of making immoral and inefficient decisions, that we as school board members, based on what our governor said in the State of the State, that we're immoral and inefficient. That offends me. That offends me very, very deeply. I also sat through a special interest presentation Friday, with basically a lot of these numbers that just totally were opposite. And as you mentioned, you can pick and choose. But basically, again, as school board members, we got accused that we're only interested in money and feeding the never-ending desire of education bureaucracy. And I wanted to stand up and shout several times and couldn't, and probably was a good thing I didn't. But I guess over the years, as I've sat in this seat, I have seen the legislature do a lot of things to justify their actions. They've moved money from one pot to another to claim it, to say that they were getting it. The 20 mills recently was just one example, but it goes back to when I started. And none of those ever offend me, because I think overall we want to look at it. But at the same point, we want to have this we have a communication problem. We also need to really realize is that there's an element in our state that they really do want to starve the beast and get rid of public education. And so I guess at the same point, this is great information to have that. And I really hope that the vast majority of our legislators will understand some of these things. But quite frankly, it's been difficult to sit down and talk to legislators because they don't want to believe the facts that are on paper. I've challenged many of them to sit down with me and go over our budget with us, and they're not willing to do that. Others are, and they have, and they've come to an understanding that, at the end of the day, when we're moving money around, yes, we have some money we can change or do here or do there, but, when they put out the mantra that all we spend on is administration, not on teachers. Administrators haven't had any more of a raise than our teachers have, and that's a shame. I mean, that's really, really difficult. So I guess the one question I have is, as you saw Montoy, when we got the Montoy decision and the funding, where did you see school boards concentrating those dollars? What did they spend it on? What did they do? And what was their overall aim for those funds?
I'm trying to recall. Actually, I think we emailed to you a document, a Word document that was really the testimony that we provided to the K-12 Student Success Committee. And I think what I indicated, well, when districts ever get more money, and certainly after Montoy, what do they do with it? Well, number one, they usually add people, because you have to add people to either have new programs or lower class sizes, essentially bringing more human effort to bear per child. Takes more people. Number two, you will look to the compensation of those people to keep them, and so that will tend to raise your cost at least above inflation. Number three, you will look at your physical plant to try to make sure it's safe, it's efficient, it's meeting your needs. And number four, you will do things to enhance services like transportation. Many districts, one of the things they did with new money was increase the number of kids they transport, whether it's for safety, whether it's for attendance. But so that was something with new money that didn't just go to pay teachers more or hire more teachers, but school boards across the state obviously believed that that would have an impact on students. But quite frankly, that's all you can do with new money. And so to a greater or lesser degree, that's what districts did. And if you got more money tomorrow, you would do, I'm quite confident, some combination of those things. And of course, if you have less money in real terms, you have to withdraw doing all of those things. So it's more than anything. It's first and fundamentally, it's looking at your staff, the people you have doing the work. It's usually adding more people, and that's what I found striking. I didn't know what these numbers would show me, but what they tend to show us is Kansas, a high-achieving state, and other high-achieving states has more people. That's one thing I really took from this. And the last thing, because I have to have the last word, is to also say that there's another, here's the rough side of that. We are a high-achieving state, we spend about average, and we are very low in class. We have more people, we have more teachers. So what does that do to salaries? We have low salaries nationally. We could have higher salaries and spend the same amount of money if we had fewer people. But the decisions that Kansas has collectively made is to say, we're going to have more people, but inevitably, we aren't going to be able to pay them as much. I mean, that's just almost inevitable unless you raise the total dollars to a higher ranking as well.
And then finally, go back to your third slide, if you would. The line, let's see, number 4. I guess maybe it was one before that. Yeah, number 4.
Okay.
Aid to capers. If the legislature authorizes the governor to take $100 million out of capers this year, will they take that off of our numbers as well?
Well, I'll take it. All I can tell you is I'll take it. And I think, and honestly, and this, if we're looking for a place to have common ground, that's one of the things I decided this is a good place to start because basically this is right out of the governor's budget.
Yeah.
And so next year's budget, if that's out, yes, it will be lower. And I've just said, to me, the most important thing we have to do is try to be consistent and just ask everyone else to be consistent. And so if we've said that adding money to capers, while important, doesn't help the classroom, then I think we have to be consistent in saying, you know, if the legislature makes that adjustment or the governor makes that adjustment, I don't know if that's great for capers, but I don't think we can stand up and say, you're cutting this. I mean, at least we have to be consistent, and I think that hopefully will be the right example to give.
Okay. Thank you.
And Mark, there is an area where our teachers and our staff feel that this isn't accurate. So I'm going to ask you to go back to Kansas has low teacher and staff ratios to students. One of the things that we've looked at in our district has been, even with the bond issue, was to lower class sizes. And we frequently hear the concerns that our teachers are being overwhelmed with the increased number of students. If you could address that, because I'm sure that we probably have some teachers wondering, how on earth could you come up with this statement? Would you address that?
Well, number one, my disclaimer is this is what I got from the federal government. So I have not gone to look at other states, but I think what people would say is, you know, I mean, again, as blunt as this is to say, if you can move to other states and earn more, but you're probably going to have even more kids in your classroom. Because we are literally, and I don't, in the report I sent you, if you want to look it up, we are, I believe, in the bottom 5, if not number 48, in terms of the lowest ratio of students to teachers. We are extraordinarily low. And that doesn't mean that in every teacher's class or in every district or building it's going to feel that way. And it doesn't mean that if you are having an influx of students in a particular district, that ratio might not be going up. But I'm just saying, all I can say is the numbers would say that on average, which is all we can do, the average Kansas class size compared to the average class size of most other states, there are fewer kids per teacher.
Would it be accurate then that to state that it's the number of districts that we have, the small districts that we have, that's bringing this ratio more down than,
That's a very good point, and that would certainly be part of it. I don't, what we don't have here, and actually that would be very interesting research, is to kind of compare our, districts like Wichita. Well, there are no other districts like Wichita, but the most comparable that we could find in other states to see how that would look. You're absolutely correct. Our numbers are a statewide average, and where we have more smaller districts and smaller schools, that will bring down our overall average, no question.
well, certainly it has provided us with the information. Obviously, you can cherry pick your data depending on what kind of argument that you want to make. There are numbers to support that, yes, you're absolutely accurate. I think the challenge that we and all boards probably face is how do we hone that conversation more to what we're really experiencing. It's nice to talk in global terms, and I was thinking as Joy was speaking a few minutes ago, just how one person can see something one way and another see it totally different. And Joy, if I could go back on that, when you were expressing a concern of voters having that choice, when you mentioned that particular chart about capital spending, I was thinking more voters have a direct impact on that. And then when you were talking in terms of state aid, I'm thinking that's more of an indirect impact. And it was just interesting. I had to smile because even sitting here on this board this evening, I could see how, looking at the data, we think data is the way. But looking at the data sometimes can be more confusing than not looking at the data. So I would like to take the opportunity to thank you for your presentation. Hopefully it has proven useful to us in our conversations with the legislature and the community.
Well, certainly if any of you want to explore, and certainly your staff or anyone in more detail any of this, you certainly know where to find me because you found me to invite me to come down, which I'm very pleased you did, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
We do appreciate you. Thank you. Mike, we're ready for the next item.